A Mexican-American war lieutenant found a sack of gold meant to bribe his general, then burned it and told his men the enemy offered nothing but bullets. And I think about that story every time I have to lie to the people I love. It was a dusty piece of history I read in a textbook back in high school in Ohio, sitting at a desk with carvings in the wood from 10 years of bored teenagers before me, never once thinking that I'd eventually find myself standing on the other side of a similar silence. Back then, my biggest worry was whether Sarah would agree to go to the homecoming dance in my rusted-out Chevy, or if the transmission would give out on the way to the drive-in. My life was defined by the smell of cut grass on a Saturday morning, the specific metallic tang of the local machine shop where I spent my summers sweeping floors for my old man, and the feeling that the world was wide, safe, and entirely predictable. I believed in things that felt solid, like the flag on the post office and the promise that if you worked hard and kept your nose clean, the path ahead stayed clear. I didn't know then that the path doesn't stay clear. It gets reclaimed by the weeds while you aren't looking. I enlisted because I wanted to be part of something that moved the needle, something that made my father look at me with that rare, quiet pride that usually only surfaced when we finished a tough job together. I remember the morning I signed the papers. The recruiter's office had that institutional smell of stale coffee and industrial floor wax, a scent that I've come to associate with every major transition in my adult life. He was a guy named Sergeant Miller, a man who spoke in complete utilitarian sentences, and he didn't try to sell me on glory. He just looked at my high school transcript and told me the infantry was where the real work happened. I walked out of that building into a bright, blindingly normal Tuesday afternoon, and for a second, I felt like I was vibrating, like I'd just stepped onto a high-speed train and couldn't get off even if the doors hadn't locked behind me. Boot camp was a blur of sand, sweat, and the realization that the version of myself I brought with me, the kid who played varsity ball and knew the layout of every side street in town, wasn't just inadequate, it was a liability. They stripped away the soft edges, replacing my civilian reflexes with muscle memory that eventually became more reliable than my own thoughts. You stop being an individual in those early days. You're part of a machine, a collection of limbs and rifles moving in a cadence you don't even have to think about. I remember the first time I realized I actually loved the guys in my platoon. It wasn't a grand, cinematic moment. It was a midnight watch, 4 in the morning, freezing cold, with a guy named Higgins. We were sharing a heater that barely worked, huddled together in the dark, whispering about how much we missed real pizza, not the frozen cardboard back at the DFAC, but the kind with the greasy pepperoni and the crust that crunched when you bit into it. We laughed until our sides hurt, a quiet, ragged sound that felt like the most important thing in the world at that moment. We weren't worried about the future. We weren't worried about the war. We were just two kids from opposite ends of the country, trying to stay warm and keeping each other sane in a place that didn't care if we existed or not. When we finally touched down in the desert, the reality hit me like a physical blow. The air had a weight to it, a dry, suffocating heat that carried the scent of burnt oil, pulverized rock, and something deeper, something ancient that felt hostile to human life. The FOB wasn't the base I'd imagined from the movies. It was a sprawling, chaotic mess of gravel, HESCO barriers, and constant, low-level tension that vibrated through the soles of your boots. You spend a lot of time waiting in that place. You wait for patrols, you wait for intel, you wait for the mail that sometimes takes 3 weeks to catch up to you. It's the waiting that messes with you. It's the way you find yourself staring at a wall for an hour, your brain replaying the same loop of a conversation with your mom, wondering if she's sleeping okay or if she's watching the news every night, terrified of a knock at the door. I didn't tell her the truth in my letters. I wrote about the heat, about the shitty coffee, about the funny things the guys said. I kept it light, kept it normal, because if I told her about the fear that lived in the back of my throat, she'd have felt it too. I was protecting her, or maybe I was just trying to convince myself that there was still a normal version of me waiting to go home. My squad leader was a guy named Staff Sergeant Vance. He was a man made of scarred knuckles and silences. He didn't say much, but when he did, you stopped whatever you were doing and listened. He treated us like we were his own sons, which is a hell of a burden to carry when you know exactly how dangerous the work is. He used to tell us, stay inside your head, stay inside the mission, and keep your eyes on the man next to you. I took that to heart. I became obsessed with my gear, checking my mags, cleaning my weapon until it shone, making sure my ruck was balanced perfectly. It was the only thing I could control. The rest of it, the wides, the snipers, the sudden violent bursts of chaos, that was just the weather. You can't argue with the weather. You just try to stay dry. There was a day about 4 months in that still sits in my gut like a stone. It was a routine patrol through a sector that had been quiet for weeks. We were walking down a narrow track, the sun beating down on our helmets, the dust coating our faces until we all looked like we were carved from the same gray clay. I remember noticing a small, bright blue plastic bottle sitting in the dirt near a cluster of rocks. It was so out of place, so vibrant against the muted colors of the terrain, that I stopped for a second to look at it. It was a child's toy, maybe, or just garbage, but in that environment, anything out of the ordinary was a red flag. I remember the way the air went still. Not just quiet, but asterisk still asterisk, like the world was holding its breath. My heart started that heavy, rhythmic thumping against my ribs, a sound I could hear inside my own head, drowning out the ambient noise of the desert. I signaled the guy behind me to stop, my hand trembling just slightly. I've never told anyone this, but in that second I didn't think about the mission. I didn't think about the lieutenant's gold or the war or the grand scope of history. I thought about the backyard in Ohio. I thought about the smell of the damp earth after a spring rain, and the way my sister used to run through the sprinklers in her swimsuit, laughing. It was so vivid I could almost feel the cold water on my skin, which was the most terrifying thing I'd ever felt, because it meant I wasn't here, I was back there, and if I was back there, I wasn't watching the road. I shook myself out of it, the cold reality of the desert rushing back in. I moved the patrol forward, my eyes scanning every inch of the path, my finger hovering just off the trigger. We got through that stretch, but the feeling never went away. It settled into my bones. That night, sitting in the guard tower, I looked at the moon and realized I couldn't remember what my house looked like from the outside. I knew the floor plan, I knew which stair creaked, I knew the way the kitchen light flickered when the fridge kicked on, but the asterisk look asterisk of the house, the exterior, was gone. It was like I'd been erased. I remember another night, a few weeks later. We were sitting in the back of a Humvee, exhausted, covered in a fine layer of grit that seemed to have permeated our skin. Higgins pulled a crumpled pack of cards out of his pocket, and we started a game of rummy, playing by the light of a tiny, dim red bulb. We were laughing about something stupid. I think it was about how the supply sergeant looked like a bullfrog in a uniform, and for a heartbeat, it was like we weren't in a war zone at all. It was just four guys, bored on a Tuesday, killing time. The joy of that moment was so sharp it was almost painful. It was the kind of joy you only get when you've been stripped of everything else, when you realize that the only thing that matters is the guy across from you. Then, just as quickly as it came, the radio crackled. The commander's voice, flat and distorted, cut through the space, issuing coordinates for a sector we hadn't patrolled yet. The laughter didn't just stop, it evaporated. It was like a curtain had been pulled down. We stood up, the metal floor of the vehicle clanging under our boots, and started checking our loadouts again. That's how it was. You'd have these brief, blinding sparks of humanity, and then the job would demand everything back. You don't have time to mourn the laughter, and you certainly don't have time to process the fear. You just move. You check your gear, you look at your watch, and you wait for the word. It was late, maybe 2 in the morning, when the order came down for a movement that felt different. Staff Sergeant Vance gathered us in the common area, a space defined by a single bare bulb and the constant, low hum of a generator outside. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired you get from a long day's work, but a bone-deep, hollowed-out exhaustion that I'd only started seeing in him over the last few weeks. He spread a map out on the table, the paper yellowed and crinkled at the edges. He didn't look at any of us. He just pointed to a spot on the map, a grid coordinate that sat in a valley about 10 miles from our current position. He said it was a recovery mission, that there had been some chatter about a cache discovered by a scouting team, but his eyes were darting, moving faster than his words. He was holding something back. I could see it in the way he kept clearing his throat, the way he kept his hands flat on the table, pressing down hard enough to turn his knuckles white. I watched him and realized with a sudden, sinking clarity that he was trying to figure out how to lie to us. He wasn't a man who lied. He was the most honest, direct human being I'd ever known, but he was clearly wrestling with something he couldn't put into words. He looked up then, meeting my eyes for the first time that night, and there was a question there. Not a request for advice, but a silent acknowledgement of the burden we were all carrying. He paused, his gaze lingering on mine for a second too long, the silence in the room stretching out until it felt like the walls were closing in. He took a breath, his chest rising and falling slowly, and he reached out as if to say something, but he stopped. The room was deathly quiet, the only sound the distant, rhythmic clicking of a cooling engine outside. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew, as sure as I was breathing, that the man I was before this moment was about to be left behind in that room, and the man who walked out of it would be a stranger to the boy who sat in that desk in Ohio. He opened his mouth to speak, the name of the valley hovering on his lips, and I held my breath, waiting for the first word that would decide the rest of my life. He said the name of the valley, and it sounded like a funeral rite, a low, guttural syllable that didn't belong in the mouth of a man who usually dealt in practicalities. We were moving at 0300. The pre-dawn in that part of the world isn't dark so much as it is a bruise, a deep, sickly purple that clings to the horizon and makes every shadow look like a person waiting to kill you. I spent the 2 hours before we rolled out sitting on my cot, staring at the inside of my helmet. I had a photo of Sarah tucked into the lining, a Polaroid from the county fair, her hair caught in the wind, a bright blue sky behind her that looked like a different planet. I traced the edge of the frame with my thumb until the plastic felt warm. I wasn't praying. I wasn't even thinking. I was just trying to calibrate my hands so they wouldn't shake when I grabbed my rifle. The ride out was silent. Usually we'd bicker about music or tell stories about the dumbest things we'd done in high school, the kind of talk that anchors you to a life that actually happened. But this time, nobody spoke. The Humvee hit every rut in the road with a bone-jarring thud, the suspension screaming in protest. Higgins was sitting across from me, his head back against the nylon webbing, eyes closed. He had a habit of drumming his fingers on his thigh whenever he was anxious, a frantic, syncopated rhythm that he didn't even know he was doing. I watched his fingers, trying to match the beat to my own heartbeat, and I wondered if he was thinking about the same thing I was. I wondered if he was already gone, if his mind had wandered off to a porch swing or a classroom or a girl waiting for him to write back, and if he was going to have as hard a time coming back as I knew I would. We stopped about a mile out. The engines cut off, and the silence that rushed in was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that made your ears ring. We moved on foot, fanning out in the loose, fluid formation we drilled 1,000 times until it was instinctive. The terrain was broken, sharp, volcanic rock that tore at our boots and hidden gullies that seemed to drop away into nothing. It was cold enough to see our breath, a ghostly vapor that vanished as soon as it left our lips. Vance was in the lead, his pace steady, relentless. He was a machine, his body angled forward, his rifle held in a way that suggested he was ready for a fight that hadn't started yet. I followed him, my pack digging into my shoulders, every muscle in my body coiled tight. I remember the smell, the ozone, the dry dust, and that faint, metallic scent of cold steel that seems to cling to everything when you're out in the middle of nowhere, waiting for the worst to happen. We reached the mouth of the valley just as the sun began to bleed over the jagged peaks. It wasn't a beautiful sunrise. It was a harsh, unforgiving light that exposed everything, the scrub, the rocks, the deep, hollow silence of the canyon. We held position, scanning the ridgeline. My eyes felt like they were vibrating in their sockets. Every bush looked like a muzzle flash. Every shadow looked like a man with a weapon. I felt the familiar, cold crawl of fear along my spine, the kind that isn't about being brave or cowardly, but about the physiological certainty that you are being hunted. I looked over at Higgins. He was crouched behind a boulder, his face smeared with dust, eyes wide and fixed on the high ground. He caught me looking, and for a split second he offered a weak, tight-lipped grin. It was the saddest thing I'd ever seen. It was the face of a man who knew exactly what the odds were and was choosing to keep smiling anyway. I wanted to tell him something meaningful, something that would fix everything, but I had no words. I just nodded, a sharp, jerky movement of my head, and looked back at the valley. That was when the first shot rang out. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic crack. It was a sharp, flat snap, like a branch breaking in a quiet forest. It hit the ground near my feet, sending a spray of rock and dust into my face. We didn't scramble, we reacted. We were down, behind cover, weapons up, scanning. Then the valley erupted. It wasn't a firefight, it was a wall of sound. The air filled with the chaotic, rhythmic thrum of automatic fire, bullets stitching lines across the rocks above us, the sound of impact dull and sickening. I don't remember the next 10 minutes. My body took over. I was firing, reloading, moving, yelling commands I didn't even hear myself give. The world narrowed down to the sights of my rifle, the brass casing ejecting and hitting the ground, the smell of cordite thick enough to taste. I was locked into the rhythm of it, fire, move, cover, reload. It's a strange, surreal state, a kind of dark, feverish focus where nothing exists except the target and the next piece of cover. And then there was a lull. The firing stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving a ringing, dead silence in its wake. I shifted my position, looking for Vance. He was about 20 yards away, hunched behind a berm. He was signaling me to move, his gestures sharp and urgent. I lunged forward, sliding over the loose shale, and that's when I saw it. Higgins was lying in the middle of the open ground between us, face down. He wasn't moving. The light was hitting him, and for a moment he looked like he was just resting, like he'd stopped to catch his breath. I don't know why, but I felt a surge of irrational, blinding rage. I stood up, exposed, and started running toward him. I didn't care about the fire, about the enemy, about the mission. I just wanted to reach him. I got to him, my lungs burning, my heart hammering against my chest like a trapped bird. I flipped him over, and the breath left my body in a long, shuddering gasp. His face was completely calm, eyes half open, looking up at the sky as if he were watching the clouds roll by. There was no pain, no fear, just a total, profound absence. I reached out and shook his shoulder, saying his name, but my voice was thin, reedy, like something from far away. He didn't answer. He couldn't answer. I looked down at his chest, at the dark, spreading stain on his uniform, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be truly alone. It wasn't a quiet loneliness. It was a screaming, physical presence, a void that opened up right there in the dust and started pulling me in. I sat there, cradling his head, my hand covered in the warm, sticky reality of his blood, and I watched the sun continue to climb, indifferent, uncaring, a ball of fire that just kept on burning. The world didn't stop. That was the most terrifying part. The wind kept blowing, moving the dust across his face. A bird, some kind of carrion scavenger, circled high overhead, a black speck against the brilliant blue. I wanted to scream, to stop the clock, to force the universe to acknowledge that a man who loved greasy pepperoni and hated the supply sergeant had just ceased to exist, but the valley just sat there, silent and vast. I looked back toward where Vance was. He was staring at me, his face a mask of grief and duty. He didn't come over. He couldn't. He had to keep moving, had to keep the rest of us alive. I had to get up. I had to leave him there. I looked down at Higgins one last time, at the way his fingers were curled, still holding the strap of his rifle, and I felt a piece of my own soul snap off and stay there with him, buried under that layer of grit and heat. I stood up. My knees were shaking so hard I could barely support my own weight, but I stood up. I walked back toward the lines, my boots heavy as lead, each step feeling like I was wading through deep, freezing water. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel patriotic. I felt like a ghost, a hollowed-out shell that was still moving because it didn't know how to stop. When I got to the position, nobody said anything. We couldn't. To speak would have been to admit it, to give voice to the horror that was currently soaking into the earth a few dozen yards away. We just adjusted our gear, cleared our weapons, and waited. The patrol continued. We moved through the rest of that day like sleepwalkers, our eyes scanning the ridges, our fingers hovering over triggers, doing the work because there was nothing else to do. Every time I heard a sound, a snap of wood or a rustle of wind, I expected it to be him, expected him to walk up, complaining about the heat or asking if I'd heard from home. The day dragged on for an eternity. The sun, which had felt like a comfort a few hours before, now felt like an accusation, a bright, pitiless light that showed everything too clearly. By the time the shadows began to stretch across the valley, I was physically sick. My stomach was a knot of cold, hard bile. I kept tasting him, not blood, but the memory of him, the smell of his old sweat, the way his voice sounded when he talked about the pizza back home. It was everywhere. I tried to look at the map, to focus on the terrain, but all I could see was his face, the way his eyes looked when they weren't seeing anything anymore. Vance walked by at one point, his hand coming to rest briefly on my shoulder. It wasn't a pat or a gesture of comfort. It was a weight, an acknowledgement of the burden we were sharing. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. We were both carrying the exact same dead weight, and we both knew we weren't going to set it down. We didn't get back to the FOB until long after dark. The ride back was even worse than the ride out. The Humvee was a coffin on wheels, the air inside thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the lingering metallic tang of the day's work. I stared at the back of the driver's head, watching the way his helmet shifted with the bumps, and I felt like I was floating, disconnected from my own body. I kept waiting to wake up. I kept waiting for the smell of grass, for the sound of my mother's voice calling me for dinner, for the trivial, boring, beautiful life I'd left behind to reach out and pull me back from the edge. But it didn't come. I was still there. I was still in the valley, still sitting in the dust, still holding his head. The truck hit a massive crater in the road, tossing us all into the air, and for a second I felt a wild, dark impulse to just jump out, to run back into the darkness and find him, to bring him home, even if he was already broken. I gripped the edge of the seat, my knuckles white, my jaw locked until my teeth ached. We offloaded in the dark. The FOB was quiet, save for the constant, low-frequency hum of the generators. We didn't talk. We just stripped off our gear, the heavy plates, the magazines, the helmet, the ruck, the rifle, all of it felt like a costume I'd been forced to wear for a play that had gone horribly wrong. I walked to my cot and sat down, staring at my boots, which were coated in the fine, gray dust of the valley. I didn't take them off. I couldn't move. I heard the other guys in the tent, the rustle of gear, the heavy, ragged breathing of exhausted men trying to find sleep, but it all sounded like it was coming from underwater. I reached into my pocket and touched the Polaroid of Sarah. My finger caught on a smear of something, a speck of blood or dirt, I didn't know which, and I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. I wasn't the same man who'd looked at that picture that morning. That man was gone, lost somewhere between the ridge and the rock, and I was just the thing that had crawled back in his place. I laid down on the cot, but I didn't close my eyes. I watched the ceiling, the way the light from the searchlights outside flickered through the gaps in the fabric, casting long, shifting shadows that looked like grasping hands. I kept seeing his face. I kept seeing the way his fingers curled. I kept hearing the shot, the silence, the sound of my own breath ragged in the cold air. I knew I should sleep. I knew I needed to, that tomorrow would be another day of patrolling, of waiting, of doing the work, but the thought of sleep was a terror. If I slept, I'd be back there. If I slept, I'd have to relive it all over again. I lay there for hours, my eyes wide, my body rigid, listening to the rhythm of the camp, the distant, mechanical sounds of a war that didn't care if I lived or died, and I wondered if this was it. If this was the rest of my life. A few tents away, someone started to cry. It wasn't a loud, sobbing thing. It was a soft, jagged animal sound that seemed to be fighting to stay quiet, a muffled desperation that tore through the thin fabric of the night. It went on for a long time, the rhythm of it slow and steady, like a heartbeat. I wanted to go over, to find out who it was, to sit with them in the dark, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the sheer weight of it, the collective, unvoiced grief that was pressing down on all of us. We were all sitting there in our own corners of the dark, staring at the same shadows, carrying the same ghosts. I wondered if Vance was awake, if he was lying on his cot, his hands pressed into the mattress, wondering how he was going to look at our families when we got back, if any of us got back. I felt a sudden, sharp surge of anger at the world, at the recruiters, at the textbooks back in Ohio, at the very idea that a man could ever be the same after seeing something like this. The radio outside squawked, a sharp, distorted burst of static that cut through the silence like a knife. It was just a routine check, a voice calling out coordinates, but it made me jump so hard my entire body thrashed on the cot. My heart was racing, a frantic, desperate rhythm that echoed in my ears. I sat up, gasping for air, my hand flying to my rifle, which was propped against the frame of the cot. I was drenched in sweat, the cold air making me shiver violently. I sat there in the dark, my breath coming in jagged, painful gulps, waiting for my nerves to stop firing. I looked at my hands. They were trembling, a fine, uncontrollable vibration that I couldn't suppress no matter how hard I tried. I gripped the edge of the cot, digging my fingers into the canvas, trying to ground myself, trying to bring the memory of that house in Ohio back into my head, but it wouldn't come. The vision was gone, replaced by the memory of the valley, of the heat, of the way Higgins had looked at the sky. I realized then that the silence of the night was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything we'd done, everything we'd seen, and everything we were still expected to do. It was a pressure cooker, a containment field for all the horror and the guilt and the exhaustion that was building up in every one of us. I wondered if the guys back home, the ones who were still sitting in high school classrooms or working at the machine shop, had any idea what was happening, what kind of change was being forged in the dark. I bet they didn't. I bet they thought it was all like the movies, like the stories in the books, clean, linear, and meaningful. They didn't know about the grit. They didn't know about the way your soul starts to erode, grain by grain, until there's nothing left but the frame. I eventually drifted off, though I wouldn't call it sleep. It was more of a lapse, a falling into a void where the images were just as sharp, just as persistent. I was back in the valley, but this time I was searching for something. I was digging in the dirt, my hands raw and bleeding, trying to find something I'd lost. I knew it was important, that my life depended on it, but every time I thought I found it, it slipped through my fingers. I kept digging, the earth getting harder, the sun getting hotter, until I couldn't see anything at all, just a wall of blinding, white light. I woke up with my heart pounding, my throat dry, the first gray light of dawn already creeping into the tent. It was time. The day was starting, and I had to put the uniform on, lace the boots, pick up the rifle, and walk out into the desert again. I moved with a kind of numb, mechanical efficiency. I didn't look at the others. I didn't say good morning. We all had the same look, hollowed out, eyes distant, movements sharp and hurried. We were ghosts, performing the motions of life in a place that had already declared us dead. We ate in silence, the same dry, tasteless ration, the taste of it turning to ash in my mouth. We checked our gear, the same ritual, the same check and double check, but the meaning had changed. It wasn't about readiness anymore. It was about survival, about keeping the shell intact for another few hours, another few miles. I saw Vance in the supply area, his back to me. He was staring at a map, his hands flat on the table, the same way he'd stood the night before. I watched him for a second, wondering if he felt as broken as I did, if he was just as terrified of what the day might bring, and then I turned away. I couldn't look at him. If I looked at him, I'd see myself, and I wasn't ready to see that yet. The patrol was brutal. The heat seemed to have doubled overnight, a heavy, oppressive blanket that turned the air into something thick and hard to breathe. We moved through the same landscape, the same rocks, the same dry, empty valleys, but everything felt different. The silence was heavier, the shadows more threatening. Every time I looked at the guy in front of me, I didn't see him. I saw the space where Higgins should have been. I saw the way his gear would have sat, the way he would have moved, the way he would have looked back at me with that tired, resigned grin. It was a ghost, a presence that was more real than the men who were still breathing. I tried to focus, to do the job, but my mind kept drifting, kept circling back to the ridge, to the moment the world ended. We reached a small village about noon. It was nothing more than a cluster of mud brick houses, a few goats, and a well that had long since run dry. We were tasked with clearing the area, looking for signs of the guys who'd hit us the day before. It was a monotonous, soul-crushing job. We kicked indoors, checked under floors, looked behind walls, all while the inhabitants watched us with a mixture of fear and something else, something cold and calculated. I felt like an intruder, a blight on the landscape, and for the first time I wondered what we were actually doing there. I remembered the lieutenant's gold, the story about the bribe and the general, and I wondered if we were the ones being bribed, only we weren't being paid in gold. We were being paid in trauma, in hollowed-out memories, in pieces of our own souls. I looked at the faces of the people watching us, and I didn't see enemies. I saw victims just like us. I saw people who were trapped in the same machinery, the same endless, grinding cycle of violence that didn't care about justice or history or anything other than the next explosion. I stepped out of a house, my eyes burning from the dust, and collided with Vance. He was looking at the village, his expression unreadable. He looked at me, then at the empty, desolate landscape, and he sighed, a sound that seemed to pull all the oxygen out of the space between us. He didn't speak. He just gestured toward the perimeter. I turned and walked away, my boots crunching on the dry earth. I felt a surge of something, not anger, not sadness, but a deep, overwhelming exhaustion. I wanted to sit down right there in the dirt, to pull my knees to my chest, and to wait for the world to stop. I wanted someone to come and tell me that it was all a mistake, that we were going home, that I could go back to the machine shop and the Chevy and the smell of cut grass. But I knew that wasn't going to happen. I knew the world wasn't waiting for us to come back because we weren't the same people anymore. We were something else, something forged in the fire, something that didn't belong anywhere else. We spent the rest of the day in a state of high alert, the tension so thick it felt like I could reach out and grab it. We knew someone was watching us. We could feel the eyes, the weight of the scrutiny, but we didn't know where it was coming from. It was the same feeling as the day before, the same sense of being hunted, but now it was worse. Now we knew what it meant. Now we knew the cost. Every rustle of the wind, every movement of a shadow was a reminder of the fragility of our existence. I felt my finger on the trigger, the safety off, my heart pounding a rhythm that felt like a countdown. We were waiting for the snap, the pop, the eruption of fire that would take another one of us, and I found myself wishing, in a dark, twisted way, that it would just happen. I wanted the waiting to end. I wanted to get it over with, to stop the cycle of fear, even if it meant the worst. The sun began to dip, the colors of the desert turning from a harsh, blinding gold to a deep, bruised purple. We were exhausted, our bodies sagging, our minds frayed, but we didn't stop. We kept moving, the shadows lengthening, the dark closing in. I looked at the guys around me, their faces smeared with grime, their eyes hollow, and I felt a surge of love so intense it almost brought me to my knees. These were my brothers. These were the only people on the planet who understood what I was going through, the only ones who could see the ghosts that were walking with us. We were all carrying the same weight, all struggling to keep the same mask on, all trying to stay human in a place that was designed to strip that away. I wanted to reach out, to touch their shoulders, to tell them that I was with them, that we were in this together, but we didn't have the words. We never had the words. We just kept moving, our silence a testament to the things we were holding in, the things we were never going to be able to tell anyone back home. As the last of the light faded, we set up a defensive position on a low ridge overlooking the approach to the village. We were hunkered down in the cold, the desert air biting through our gear, our eyes fixed on the darkness. I felt the same cold crawl of fear that I'd felt the day before, the same certainty that we were being watched, but this time there was something else, a sense of inevitable, crushing weight. I looked at the moon, a sliver of white in the black, and I wondered if Sarah was looking at the same moon, if she was thinking about me, if she even knew that the boy she'd sent away was already gone. I felt a pang of guilt, deep and sharp. I hadn't been honest with her. I hadn't been honest with anyone. I'd been living a double life, the one I wrote about in my letters and the one I lived in the dirt and the dark, and I didn't know how I was ever going to reconcile the two. I was a stranger to myself, a man built out of memories and ghosts, and I was sitting in the cold, waiting for a fight that I didn't even know if I wanted to win. The night air grew colder. My breath was a steady, rhythmic plume of white. I checked my watch, the glow of the dial a tiny, artificial light in the vast, consuming dark. 2200. We'd be out here for another 6 hours at least. I felt my eyes begin to flutter, the sheer exhaustion clawing at my eyelids, but I forced them open, my muscles aching with the effort. I looked at Vance. He was sitting a few feet away, his back against a boulder, his head bowed. He looked like a statue, a monument to everything we'd lost. I wondered if he was thinking about Higgins, if he was replaying that moment in the valley, if he was second-guessing every decision he'd made. I wanted to walk over to him, to sit by him, to share the weight, but I stayed where I was. There was a distance between us now, a chasm created by the things we'd seen, and I didn't know if we'd ever be able to cross it again. Then I heard it. A sound, faint and distant, but unmistakable. The crunch of boots on rock. It wasn't the sound of our patrol. It was the sound of someone moving with purpose, someone who knew the terrain, someone who was coming for us. I felt my heart stop. I felt the air freeze in my lungs. I reached out and tapped the guy next to me, my hand shaking, and whispered, "Contact, front." The word hung in the air, a declaration of intent, a breaking of the silence that we'd been holding onto for hours. The line went rigid, the tension snapping into focus. My rifle felt heavy, almost unbearable in my hands, but I brought it up, my eyes scanning the darkness, the sights catching the starlight. I was terrified, the most terrified I'd ever been, but it wasn't the paralyzing fear of the day before. It was a cold, sharp, predatory focus. I was ready. I was waiting. I was going to see it through, whatever the cost, because there was nothing left to do but finish the work we'd started, even if the work had already destroyed us. The sound grew louder. The darkness seemed to churn, to shift, as if the desert itself were breathing. I tightened my grip on the rifle, my finger resting on the trigger, the safety flicking off with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the silence. I wasn't thinking about the mission. I wasn't thinking about the lieutenant's gold. I was thinking about Higgins, about his smile, about the empty space he'd left in the world, and about the fact that I was still here, still breathing, still waiting for the next move. I leaned forward, my chest pressed against the cold stone, my eyes fixed on the shifting shadows, and I held my breath. I knew with a certainty that settled into my bones like lead that the next few seconds were going to decide everything. They were going to decide if I'd ever go back, if I'd ever see the machine shop again, if I'd ever feel like a human being again. And I didn't care. I just wanted to see what was coming. I just wanted to be there, to witness the end of it, to meet the thing that had been hunting us for so long, and to finally let the silence take over. The shadows coalesced. A form took shape, a dark, ragged outline against the pale, starlit ground. I didn't wait for a command. I didn't wait for a signal. I brought my sights to bear, the image of the man clear and sharp, and I felt my finger tighten on the trigger. The silence which had been pressing on us for days, for weeks, for an eternity, finally broke. The world erupted, a chaos of fire and sound and motion, and as I fired, as the rifle kicked against my shoulder and the brass started to fly, I felt the last, lingering piece of the boy from Ohio drift away, dissolved into the cold, indifferent desert air. I was a man now, a creature of duty and loss, and as the valley filled with the smoke and the fury, I kept firing, kept moving, and kept searching for something I knew I'd never find. I was in the middle of it, the absolute crushing center of the thing I'd been running for my entire life, and I realized with a strange, dark sense of clarity that I wasn't afraid anymore. I was just waiting for the final, absolute silence to catch up to me. The flight home was not the parade or the relief I had rehearsed in my head 100 times over. It was 17 hours of pressurized cabin air, the hum of jet engines that sounded too much like incoming mortar rounds, and a quiet so deep it felt like the ocean. I sat by a window, staring at the Atlantic, watching the sunlight play off the water, trying to reconcile the man who had boarded that plane with the one who was supposed to step off it. I had the dog tags in my pocket, Higgins's tags. They felt like they weighed 50 pounds each. I kept touching them, rubbing the rough metal letters until my thumb was raw, needing the pain to remind me that I was still in a body that could feel. Nobody spoke. We were all staring at the seat back in front of us, our faces like stone, the transition from a war zone to a commercial flight moving too fast for our brains to catch up. I kept closing my eyes and seeing the ridge, the silhouette, the muzzle flash, the way the dark had swallowed everything. I knew that when the landing gear dropped, I wasn't going to be coming home to the same life. I was coming home to a house that held a ghost, and I was the ghost. The airport was a blur of fluorescent lights and people who looked like they were from another dimension. My mother was standing by the gate, her face aged 10 years in the time I'd been gone, her hands clasped tight in front of her. When she saw me, she let out a sound, not a cheer, not a laugh, just a broken, jagged exhale, and she ran. The hug was the most terrifying moment of the entire deployment. She felt so fragile, her bones so small, and I felt like a monster, a creature of dust and steel and cold, hard, unfeeling habit. I stiffened, my arms rigid, my pulse skyrocketing because I was terrified I might accidentally bruise her, or that she might somehow smell the valley on my skin. I stood there, eyes open, staring at a trash can, trying to breathe, trying to remember how to be a son. She was crying, whispering my name, but it sounded like a language I hadn't spoken in years. I squeezed her back, but it felt like I was holding onto a ledge above a canyon. I was already starting to fall, and I hadn't even left the terminal. The drive to the house was worse. The streets were too clean, the grass too green, the cars too quiet. Everything looked like a set for a movie I didn't know the lines to. My dad was behind the wheel, tapping his fingers on the steering column, trying to act like nothing had changed, asking about the flight, asking about the food. I answered in monosyllables, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror, to the bushes, to the shadows under the trees. Every time we passed a construction site, my stomach dropped, expecting the percussion of an IED. I kept checking under the car whenever we stopped at a light, a habit that was already etched into my nervous system, deeper than any memory of my childhood. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked smaller, less real, a cardboard cutout of the place I dreamt about for 2 years. I walked inside and the smell hit me, the scent of lemon polish and burnt coffee, and I nearly gagged. It was too safe. It was suffocating. I went into my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress too soft, the silence too heavy, and I realized I didn't know how to sleep in a room without a weapon in my hand. The first few weeks were a slow-motion car crash. I tried to do the normal things. I'd sit at the kitchen table, try to talk about the local news or the weather, but I'd stop mid-sentence because I'd heard a siren or a door slamming, and I'd be halfway out of my chair before I realized where I was. My family watched me. They didn't say it, but they saw the way I checked the exits, the way I paced at 3 in the morning, the way I'd go into the backyard and just stand there, staring at the fence line until my face went numb. I felt the guilt like a parasite. I was here, breathing, drinking cold beer, sleeping in a real bed, and Higgins was still in the dirt. I felt like I was cheating, like I was living a life that didn't belong to me. I started drinking, not to get drunk, but to turn the lights off in my head. I'd sit in the dark of the garage, the radio playing something low and meaningless, and I'd just think about the ridge, the cold, the way the night air felt right before everything went to hell. I remember the first time I laughed. We were at a barbecue, some neighbor telling a joke about a lawnmower, and for a split second, I just let it happen. I felt the tension leave my chest, the warmth of the sun on my neck, the simple, beautiful human connection of it, and then it hit me. I stopped, the laugh dying in my throat like a throttled bird. I looked around, sure that someone had heard it, that they'd see the hypocrisy of it, the betrayal. I walked away, went into the bathroom, and stared at myself in the mirror. I didn't recognize the person staring back. The eyes were older, the lines deeper, the soul missing. I gripped the porcelain of the sink until my knuckles turned white, wishing I could just be the kid who'd left for the bus, but that kid was buried somewhere in a valley that didn't exist on any map my father owned. I washed my face, splashed cold water on my eyes, and walked back out. I stayed for the rest of the afternoon, acting the part, a hollow shell playing the role of a son who had come home. The VA was a long, beige hallway of people who all looked like me. We didn't talk much. We sat in plastic chairs, staring at the carpet, the weight of our shared silence almost physical. I saw a man there, older, his hands shaking in his lap, and I knew what he was carrying. We didn't need to speak. We nodded, a quick, barely perceptible movement, and that was the only conversation we had. I started seeing a counselor, a guy who tried to tell me about coping mechanisms and grounding techniques. He meant well, but he couldn't smell the ozone. He couldn't feel the grit in his teeth. He couldn't understand why the silence was the thing that scared me the most. I'd sit there, nodding, playing the game, but it didn't help. The only thing that helped was the quiet. The only thing that helped was realizing that I wasn't the only one who was broken. I kept Higgins's tags in a small wooden box on my nightstand. Sometimes when the night got too quiet, when the memories got too loud, I'd take them out and hold them. I'd think about the last time I saw him, the way he'd smiled, the way he'd looked at the sky. It wasn't a sad memory, not anymore. It was just a fact. A hard, cold, unchangeable fact. I was here. He wasn't, and that was it. I stopped expecting the world to make sense. I stopped waiting for the nightmares to stop, and I started learning how to live around them, the way you learn to live with a chronic pain or a missing limb. I stopped trying to be the person I was before the war, and I started trying to find out who this new man was. This man who stood in the kitchen at 2:00 a.m., drinking black coffee, looking out at the dark, still checking the perimeter. I still have the hope. It's small, quiet, and easily missed, but it's there. It's in the way I look at the sunrise now, knowing that it's just a sun, just a day, not an accusation. It's in the way I can sit through a dinner without checking the exits every 5 minutes. It's in the way I finally opened the box with Sarah's picture and didn't feel the fire, just a dull, distant ache. I'm not cured. I don't think I ever will be. I still wake up in a sweat sometimes, the taste of dust in my mouth, the sound of the valley in my ears. I still check under the car. I still avoid the loud crowds, but I'm here. I'm still standing. I'm living a life, and even if it's a quieter, harder, and more complicated life than I ever imagined, it's mine. Tonight, the wind is kicking up against the siding of the house, a low, whistling sound that reminds me of the valley, but I'm not in the valley. I'm sitting in my living room, the coffee is cooling in the mug, and the house is silent in a way that feels like peace, not a threat. I look at my hands resting on the table, and they aren't shaking. They're just hands. I've carried this for a long time, held it in the dark, kept it hidden, but tonight I finally let it sit on the table. It doesn't disappear when you say it out loud, but it changes. It becomes something you can look at, something you can acknowledge, something you can carry without it breaking your back. I'm tired, so tired, but it's a good tired, the kind of tired that comes from finally doing the work that needed to be done. I keep thinking about that walk back, the way the valley looked when the light hit the rocks, the way the world just kept turning even after everything had changed. It's a strange thing how the world keeps moving, how the grass grows, how the sun rises, how people go to work and pay their bills and complain about the traffic while the earth is still holding onto the things we left behind. We don't get to go back. We don't get to erase what happened. We don't get to undo the choices we made, or the things we saw, or the ghosts we brought home with us. But we get to keep living. We get to wake up another day, drink our coffee, look out the window at a sky that's just a sky, and find a way to be here in this moment, in this house, in this world. That's the work. That's the only work that matters. I know I'll wake up tomorrow and the memories will be there, waiting for me like old friends I didn't want to invite over. I'll have to manage them to keep them in their place, to keep the damage from spilling over into the rest of my life. But that's all right. I've learned how to do that. I've learned how to carry the weight without letting it pull me under. I've learned that the hardest thing in the world isn't going to war, it's coming home and finding a way to stay there. And yet, here I am. The room is dim, the coffee is cold, and the silence is just silence. I'm still here, and for now, that's enough. I don't need to explain it to anyone, and I don't need anyone to understand it. I just need to keep breathing, to keep moving, and to keep the hope alive, even if it's only a small, quiet, flickering thing. I'll probably leave these things out on the table for a while, just until the sun starts to hit the floorboards. I like the way the house feels before the rest of the world wakes up and starts its noise. It's the only time when the past and the present seem to agree on where I'm standing. I look at the dog tags one last time, then I slide them back into the box and shut the lid. The sound is sharp, final, and satisfying. I stand up, stretch my back, and walk over to the window, watching the first hints of blue bleed into the horizon. It's going to be a long day, but it's going to be my day. I take a breath, feeling the air fill my lungs, clean and cool, and I realize I'm not waiting for anything to happen anymore. I'm just here. That is the truth of it. That is the only truth I have left to give. The sun is coming up, and I am still standing.